Hey guys, today I'll show you a sci-fi mystery film named Silo Season 2. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The drama is set in a future world where the air is thick with lethal poison and the ground is layered with countless skeletal remains. Yet the survivors living in sealed bunkers would rather risk death than stay confined, desperate to breathe the fresh air that no longer exists. The story picks up where the last season left off. The engineer Juliet is exiled from Silo number 18 as punishment. Thanks to the protective seal she crafted herself, she survives the toxic air, unlike others who perished instantly. She ventures further and further from the silo, determined to uncover the truth. Before long, the virtual display in her helmet malfunctions, revealing the bleak reality of the outside world. They are just barren, desolate wastelands that echo the hopelessness of an apocalyptic collapse. Juliet forces herself to stay calm. After walking for some time, she notices signs of human activity, but something doesn't sit right. She wonders why the bodies she encounters are not wearing protective suits. Climbing over a small hill, she discovers Silo 17, surrounded by piles of lifeless bodies. Judging by their positions, it looks like they were trying to escape. Confusion clouds Juliet's face. With a mix of anxiety and determination, Juliet ventures into the silo. Inside, the scene is no better. Corpses are stacked high, forcing her to carefully pick her way through. She reaches the internal isolation door, which is barely ajar, too narrow for anyone to squeeze through. Spotting a lantern on the ground, she lights it, finally seeing the details around her. The door is jammed. Juliet pushes with all her strength, but it won't budge. Fortunately, a metal rod lies nearby. Using her full weight and every ounce of strength, she pries the heavy iron door open. Once inside, Juliet quickly shuts the isolation door behind her to prevent the toxic air from seeping in. That's when she notices the protective seal on her wrist is damaged. Her heart sinks. Panic sets in as she dashes toward the cafeteria. The word lies flashes across a nearby screen. Without hesitating, she grabs a few tools and heads toward the maintenance room at the bottom of the silo. Halfway there, Juliet starts gasping for air. The oxygen in her suit is running out. She needs tools to remove the mask, but there's no time. Gripping the metal rod, she smashes the protective glass, then rips off the mask and takes deep, frantic breaths. She quickly unscrews the cap of a bottle of alcohol she'd picked up earlier and sprays it over her suit to disinfect it from prolonged exposure to the toxic air. Once the immediate crisis is handled, Juliet finally takes a moment to examine her surroundings. The layout of this silo is almost identical to her original one. She wanders into a bedroom and smashes the mirror on the wardrobe door. Sure enough, a camera is hidden inside, confirming her suspicion that monitoring residents is a standard practice for silo administrators. After finding a few clothes that fit, Juliet puts them on and steps out of the room. She's puzzled. Why is there no sign of life here? The place shows clear evidence of past conflict. Remembering the message in the cafeteria, Juliet begins to piece together the truth. It's revealed that just like her original silo, the residents here were long oppressed and constantly monitored. At some point, they uncovered the administrator's deception, that the outside world was not toxic, but green and thriving. Fueled by this revelation, the lower-level residents united and staged an unprecedented rebellion. Even after the administrators destroyed the bridge to the law enforcement sector, the residents' desire for freedom remained unstoppable. When they finally gained the upper hand, the residents rushed toward the exit, only to face a brutal truth. The air outside was truly poisonous. The result is the tragic scene Juliet now witnesses, a wasteland littered with bones. She's grateful for the insulating tape her mentor, Martha, provided. It likely saved her life. Memories of her mentor flood back to her. When she was still a little girl, Juliet had always loved fixing machines, a talent her mentor immediately recognized. Martha once brought her to her home and handed her a relic from the old world, encouraging her to figure out how it worked. That simple gesture planted the seed of rebellion in her heart. Shaking off her thoughts, Juliet resumes her exploration of the silo. From the highest level, she spots lights flickering across the broken bridge. Squinting, she sees shadows moving. Her heart races. Someone is there. Finally, a chance to get answers. The bridge is destroyed halfway across, but Juliet isn't about to give up. She notices a body hanging from a nearby railing and retrieves a long rope. Tying one end to the upper railing, she grips the other tightly. She plans to swing across using momentum, but she underestimates the distance. The rope frays under the strain, snapping mid-swing. Juliet barely manages to grab the jagged edge of the broken bridge. Her grip slips against the smooth surface, and she plunges into the depths below. Luckily, the bottom of the silo is filled with groundwater. Gasping and flailing, Juliet latches onto a floating oil drum and hauls herself toward a nearby ladder. Exhausted and frustrated, she screams into the empty darkness, but deep down she knows the mission isn't over. She has to keep searching. She has to uncover the truth about the silos and the world beyond them. After changing into a new set of clothes, Juliet headed toward the restricted underground zone of the silo. She remembered the first time she had come here as a child with her companion. The walls were covered with inscriptions left behind from the previous era. Her companion had once told her about the time she fell asleep and got left behind in this place, a situation that should have been fatal, but somehow Juliet had found a way out. Remembering this story gave Juliet a sudden surge of courage. Back at the broken bridge, she knew that swinging across with a rope was no longer an option, so she decided to build a makeshift bridge herself. Using scrap materials, she assembled metal tubes and wire mesh, substituting plastic for the lack of proper rope. In no time, a crude iron bridge was ready, but getting it in place was another challenge. Fortunately, there were plenty of ropes lying around. Juliet tied one end of the bridge to a beam and carefully maneuvered the other end toward the broken edge of the bridge. Once she was confident about the distance, she released the rope, and the bridge swung down under the pull of gravity, successfully locking into place at both ends. But she knew her creation wasn't exactly stable. She tied a safety rope around her waist and stepped onto the bridge. The connection points groaned under her weight, and the occasional cracking sound made her heart race. Carefully inching toward the center, she felt the bridge start to give way beneath her. Without hesitation, she jumped, grabbing onto the far edge of the broken bridge. Dangling precariously, she hacked at the safety rope, which wasn't long enough, and used all her strength to haul herself up to the other side. There, she saw corpses were scattered around the area, evidence of a violent struggle. Following the dim glow of a light, Juliet entered a workroom. A lamp flickered on the desk. The shadow she had seen earlier turned out to be nothing more than the movement of a rotating fan. Disappointment washed over her. After all that effort, there was still no sign of another living soul. At least getting back would be easier now. Her makeshift bridge would allow for a simpler return trip. Juliet used an oil drum as a makeshift roller, pushing the bridge into place. With a loud, grinding noise, a sturdy crossing was established. Just as she was preparing to head back, music suddenly echoed from somewhere behind her. Juliet froze. Someone must have just turned it on. Following the sound, she passed through a heavy iron door. The music grew louder. Listening carefully, Juliet confirmed the sound was coming from behind that door, but it was locked. Brute force wouldn't get it open. As she considered her next move, a small hatch suddenly slid open on the iron door. A pair of eyes appeared on the other side. A man stared at her, looking surprisingly comfortable. He warned Juliet not to disturb him again, and then the hatch slammed shut. Back in Silo 18, the lower-level residents were in a frenzy. Ever since they had witnessed Juliet walking away from her punishment unharmed, even climbing over the distant hill, they had been restless with excitement. Juliet's survival proved that the outside world wasn't as dangerous as they had been told. After years of monotonous labor and confinement in the dark depths of the silo, they were desperate to escape and see the world for themselves. No one was more anxious than Bernard, the acting mayor of the silo. According to the founding regulations, if a cleaning mission failed, they had to prepare for war. Bernard's face was deathly pale. A shrill alarm suddenly blared through the silo. Bernard rushed from his private chamber and ran to the balcony. The silo was in chaos. Residents were running wild across every level, and guards were struggling to regain control. The head of the Justice Department, Robert, approached Bernard and explained that he had triggered the emergency alarm and assembled the emergency strike teams. Bernard issued a strict curfew starting at 8 p.m. every night and appointed Robert as acting commander. He also ordered increased surveillance on anyone who had been close to Juliet, especially the two names listed on the note. The chief judge, Meadows, had been awakened by the blaring alarm. Earlier, she hadn't bothered to witness Juliet's punishment firsthand, but had heard about it from the guards. It was unheard of for anyone to survive walking beyond the hill or to refuse to clean the cameras. And now, the lower-level officer, Hank, was struggling to contain the growing unrest. Meanwhile, the lower-level residents were restless and furious. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and there was no going back. As the situation threatened to spiral out of control, the head of maintenance, Knox, tried to calm the crowd. He praised Juliet's efforts, and with just a few words, he managed to ease the tension. But then Juliet's friend Shirley spoke up, pointing out that he was the one who betrayed Juliet and got her captured. Knox froze for seconds, then carefully organized his thoughts before explaining to the group that if they hadn't handed Juliet over to the Justice Department, most of them would have been in serious trouble. Shirley cut his smelly bullshit off, saying she would cut the power and shut down the air purification system, so they would have no choice but to compromise. This was clearly the kind of bold resistance the lower-level residents had the courage to make. After all, they were the ones keeping the silo's power running, and now Knox was powerless. Suddenly, a burst of water shot up from the crowd. It was Martha. Martha was highly respected among the lower-level residents, and with just a few words, she managed to disperse the crowd. Knox hurried over to warn Shirley to stop stirring things up because the consequences could be disastrous. Shirley shot him a glare and walked away, her mind filled with resentment. She still believed Knox had betrayed Juliet, and she was deeply curious about how Juliet had survived outside the silo. She suspected Martha had secretly helped Juliet, but Martha would never admit it openly. Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Officer Hank. He had received instructions from the Justice Department to escort Martha to the police station. Martha's heart sank, worried that her assistance to Juliet might have been exposed. When she saw the person locked up at the station, her suspicion was confirmed. It was the manager of the materials department, the one who had provided Juliet with the insulating tape. After Officer Hank and his deputies left, Martha quickly asked if she told them everything. The materials manager shook her head, saying she hasn't been interrogated yet, but she was planning to take all the blame. It's better than both of them facing punishment. Martha rejected the idea. After all, she had been the one in charge of the operation. She suggested that neither of them should confess. If it comes to it, they'll be executed together. Staying in the silo is the same as being dead anyway. Meanwhile, Shirley, who had seen Martha's arrest, had already pieced together the truth. The insulating tape from the IT department must have been faulty, which led to the deaths of everyone who went outside. Juliet survived because Martha had provided the proper insulating tape. Shirley was determined to make sure everyone knew this truth no matter what. Juliet's departure continued to have rippling effects. The head of the Justice Department, Robert, wanted to take control of the police station, while Juliet's former assistant, the current sheriff, Paul, began causing trouble. According to the silo's code, Robert, as a witness to Juliet's crime, was required to formally report it to Paul. Robert struggled to hold his temper as he recounted that Juliet said right in front of him that she wanted to go outside. But Paul immediately spotted a flaw, asking why she tried so hard to avoid capture by the Justice Department if she wanted to go outside. Robert was left speechless. He stammered an excuse before quickly walking away. Knox was worried about the looming rebellion. He hurried to the manufacturing department to warn the manager not to make weapons for anyone. Meanwhile, Judge Meadows, hearing a report about Juliet's escape, couldn't hide a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The next moment, she poured her drink down the sink. When Mayor Bernard arrived uninvited, hoping to share a drink with her, Meadows told him she was quitting drinking from today. Bernard turned awkward. He had come to ask for her help. He was planning to give a speech that afternoon and wanted her to publicly support him. However, Meadows refused without hesitation. Bernard tried to appeal to their past. He and Meadows had once been mentor and apprentice. He promised to give her anything she wanted, a larger living space, even coveted historical relics. Meadows responded that he still didn't understand her and pulled out an antique book titled The Wizard of Oz. She said she was just like the main character here. No one realizes that they're a big fraud, always tricking the public with small deceptions. But in the end, the character escapes in a hot air balloon. It became clear that what Judge Meadows truly wanted was freedom. By the afternoon of that day, all the residents gathered in the center of the silo. Mayor Bernard stepped up to the podium to give his speech. Instead of condemning Juliet for her actions, he praised her as the greatest hero of all time. He explained that the IT department had recently developed a new type of tape, one that could further isolate the toxins in the air. Juliet had volunteered to test it herself, which led to her famous moment of climbing over the hill outside the silo. Bernard called it a significant victory for humanity in the fight against harsh environments. Encouraged by some in the crowd, thunderous applause erupted. Seizing the moment, Bernard continued, confident that one day everyone would be able to safely leave the silo. Just then, the judge stood up and applauded Bernard, calling him the wisest leader in history. To celebrate this victory, she announced that each household would receive 5 additional credit points, a tangible benefit for everyone. The crowd cheered and clapped enthusiastically. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the crowd. Shirley cried, "This is all a lie, and the IT department deliberately provided inferior tape. Juliet didn't use a new type of tape. She used the same regular insulating tape they all use." Just then, a guard interrupted Shirley's speech, ready to take her away. But Knox quickly stepped in to defend Shirley, explaining that she was just upset and talking nonsense. With Officer Hank vouching for her, the guard relented and decided not to arrest her. However, However, after the disruption, no one believed Shirley's claims anymore. After the speech, Robert rewarded 3 residents in the crowd for stirring up the atmosphere. He then rushed over to report to the mayor, saying that the lower-level residents' emotions had calmed down and the risk of a rebellion seemed to have passed. Officer Hank opened the prison gates, signaling that Martha and the others could leave, as the mayor had already explained the origin of Juliet's tape. Martha walked out of the prison in a daze, once again realizing the management's ability to twist the truth. As the mayor passed through the building, he noticed several places with writings claiming Juliet was still alive. Feeling a bit down, he sought out the judge, who praised his flawless performance and assured him that he was a natural leader. Bernard nodded without humility, stating that managing people was like programming a computer. Although the explanation about the insulating tape was absurd, his goal was to present an alternative version of the story. If anyone tried to expose the truth, they would have to disprove the version he had told, and only then could he use force to suppress them. Unfortunately for Shirley, she became a victim of the mayor's underhanded tactics. She could no longer convince anyone to believe her perspective, so she resorted to mindlessly scribbling slogans on the walls. Fortunately, some of her colleagues vowed to stand by her, as many had worked alongside Juliet. But just then, her Martha stepped forward, advising them not to be naive since none of them can handle this. This goes to the very foundation of the silo. Shirley believed that by rallying more people, they could succeed. Martha shook her head, saying the Justice Department controls all the weapons. If her goal is to find the truth, then she will tell her now that Juliet didn't die. Meanwhile, Mayor Bernard, eager to thank the judge for supporting him, promised to fulfill any request she made. To his surprise, Meadows suddenly expressed envy for Juliet's past experiences. She leaned in close to the mayor's ear and whispered that she wanted to go outside. The scene shifts to Silo 17, where Juliet discovered the sole survivor in the central vault, a man who hadn't seen another person in years and was curious about where Juliet had come from. When he mentioned that there were over 50 similar silos, Juliet was left speechless. The higher-ups must have known about this truth, but why had they hidden it and deliberately sealed off the passages between silos? The man explained that it was to prevent rebellious individuals from seeking an escape route. Also, keeping the silos isolated ensured that any disaster in one silo wouldn't affect the others. Juliet absorbed these secrets like a sponge, but she was equally curious about the man's identity. Perhaps it was the loneliness talking, but the man was eager to share everything. His name was Solo, and he had once been an apprentice to the head of the IT department. When the rebellion broke out, his mentor ordered him to guard the vault indefinitely and let no one inside, since it contained all the classified information about the silos. No wonder Solo knew so much. But Juliet was more concerned about what had actually happened. Solo explained that it all started with a cleaning. A resident was sent out of the silo, but instead of cleaning the camera, he wrote the word lies on it. Even more shocking, he climbed over the hill and vanished from sight. This convinced the residents that the outside was safe, triggering a massive uprising. They overthrew the management and opened the silo doors, only for everyone, inside and out, to be killed by the toxic air. The more Juliet listened, the colder her heart grew. The story was eerily similar to what had happened in Silo 18. She couldn't let the same fate befall the people there. Without hesitation, she turned and left. She had to get back to Silo 18 immediately. But then reality hit her. The protective suit she'd worn to get here was already damaged. The storage room had no replacements and barely any spare parts. Juliet's heart sank. Meanwhile, her fears were becoming reality in Silo 18. While the mayor's speech had temporarily calmed the rebellious mood, some residents, believing they knew more of the truth, were stirring up trouble, trying to rally more supporters. The enforcers acted swiftly, arresting a young mechanic from the maintenance department for the crime of graffiti. But instead of intimidating the residents, the arrest only fueled more anger. Mayor Bernard took the judge to the central vault. He was still haunted by the warnings in the management manual. If the cleaning fails, prepare for war. Bernard had already started making preparations. The judge guessed that the arrest of the mechanic was his doing, but thought it was too extreme. Juliet's case was unprecedented. Strictly following the manual might not be the answer. Before leaving, the judge asked one last time if Juliet really said she wanted to go outside. Bernard nodded firmly. Suspicious, the judge visited the newly appointed head of records and voiced her doubts. Sheriff Paul couldn't give a definite answer but questioned the eyewitnesses again. One of the guards hesitated under questioning. The sheriff immediately reported this to the judge, suggesting that Juliet may have been framed. The judge now understood even the mayor she had trusted was deceiving her. Feeling conflicted, she pulled out an antique projector, an item banned under the Silo Charter, though those rules didn't apply to the elite. The image projected showed a father and his child playing happily on a beach. Hard to believe that in that era, humans could enjoy the beauty of nature so freely. Perhaps this was why the judge was so determined to leave the silo, but Bernard had no intention of following her advice. Instead, he doubled down on his harsh methods. Robert, following Bernard's orders, sought out Patrick, who had once helped Juliet escape and was still being held by the Justice Department. The enforcer threatened to drug him with a memory-wiping substance unless he cooperated on a new task. After that, he visited several retired strike team members, offering them two choices: return to active duty or take a post in the lower levels of the silo. It was clear the leadership was preparing for a major crackdown. Tensions in the lower levels were already close to boiling over. Even Juliet's father was openly defying the Silo Charter. In the past, he had secretly inserted contraceptive devices into residents suspected of dangerous thinking. Now, he had stopped. Meanwhile, Shirley led a group of mechanics to the police station, demanding the release of the arrested mechanic. The confrontation quickly escalated into a shouting match. No one noticed Patrick in the corner until he suddenly threw a Molotov cocktail into the crowd. Chaos erupted. A retired strike team member, now acting as a police officer, fired into the crowd. Residents screamed and scattered. On the ground lay a young man, barely alive. It's the young mechanic who had supported Shirley and idolized Juliet. In the end, he had become just another pawn in the game. Mayor Bernard, feeling triumphant, approached the judge. His strategy of intimidation had succeeded, and he knew it would soon spark resentment toward the maintenance department. When the enforcement department moved in to suppress the unrest, they'd have every justification. The judge advised Bernard not to take people for fools, but at this point, she wasn't interested in his schemes. Bernard understood her intentions. He had already devised an escape plan for her. He would shut down the screens in the cafeteria and the police station under the pretext of maintenance. She would have exactly 5 minutes to leave the silo and cross the hill. But first, she'd need a custom-made protective suit. As her measurements were being taken, the judge couldn't resist asking the question weighing on her mind: if Juliet really said she wanted to go outside. Her resolute tone made it hard for Bernard to meet her gaze. In Silo 17, Juliet was searching for a protective suit, but found nothing. Left with no choice, she returned to the central vault. There, she noticed a box of food sitting in front of the iron gate, clearly left for her by Solo. Without hesitation, she devoured it. She hadn't eaten since arriving. Solo explained that the suit materials were stored in the supply department, located on the lower levels, which were now completely flooded. The materials weren't something that could be easily replaced with makeshift substitutes. Even the helmet alone had a built-in imaging system. She recalled that when she first stepped outside the silo, the images she saw matched exactly what was stored on the hard drive. Her instincts told her it was all fake, which was why she had decided against cleaning the camera. Juliet then wondered why the two corpses in the hall had decomposed at such different rates. It seemed like they had died at least some time apart. The question struck a nerve with Solo, who immediately shut the iron gate's window. Realizing she had overstepped, Juliet softly thanked him for the food. Solo's eyes reappeared through the small window. He admitted that it wasn't an act of kindness. He was trying to determine whether Juliet was real. Years of isolation had left Solo plagued by hallucinations. Juliet felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for him. Later that night, loud music woke her up. This was when Solo was most awake and sharp. His mind seemed to work better at night. He suddenly suggested that if they couldn't find a protective suit, a firefighter's suit could work as a substitute. There was one in the recycling department on level 23. Juliet grabbed an oil lamp and hurried to level 23, only to find it half submerged in water. Frustrated, she returned to Solo for help. Juliet planned to dive underwater to retrieve the suit, but someone would need to operate the oxygen supply system. Solo refused outright because he had sworn never to step beyond the iron gate. Juliet pleaded with him desperately, saying thousands of lives in Silo 18 were at stake, and she had to return in time to stop a catastrophe. But Solo stood his ground. Then Juliet noticed a phrase scrawled on the wall, and from it, she deduced that those two corpses in the hall hadn't died from toxic gas. They had tried to break into the central vault and had been deliberately left to die by Solo. Juliet finally understood Solo's fear and disappointment. Without another word, she turned and left. Just as she reached the broken bridge, Solo's voice boomed behind her. He had finally stepped outside. Over the years, Solo had imagined countless times what the outside world might look like. Even the confined space of a silo felt vast to him now. His encounters with Juliet had convinced him she wasn't dangerous, and that gave him the courage to step outside. Juliet was overjoyed. She rushed back and helped the unsteady Solo to his feet. Now it was time to return to Silo 18. The scene shifts to the mechanic Shirley, who was determined to expose the truth and bring down the the upper management of Silo 18, but the mayor was one step ahead, dismantling her every move. Knox had been watching everything unfold. Quietly, he led Shirley to the restricted underground cavern. There, etched into the walls, were markings left behind years ago, records Knox had already seen before. Knox explained that after every rebellion in the silo, the management had always blamed the maintenance department. Shirley immediately understood why. The mechanics controlled the power grid. If they shut it down, they could bring the entire silo to its knees. Knox agreed, but warned that such a move would be suicidal. Instead, Knox suggested requesting a public hearing with the mayor. That way, they could seek answers through official channels. Shirley liked the idea, but in the minds of the people, the judge was the highest authority in the silo. If they were going to confront anyone, it had to be her. When the management received Knox's request, they were already seething with anger. In their eyes, the lower-level residents were the root of the rebellion. The higher up someone was, the closer they got to the exit gate. Who could guarantee they wouldn't force their way through? What they didn't expect, though, was for the judge to approve the request for a hearing. The mayor stormed over to confront her, asking if she had any idea what impact it would have if lower-level residents come up. Meadows didn't care about the mayor's concerns. She was still fuming because the protective suit the mayor had promised her hadn't arrived. The mayor gritted his teeth in frustration but didn't say a word before leaving. At the same time, upper-level residents had begun to feel uneasy, thinking that the lower-level residents were all violent. Sheriff Paul tried to reassure his wife, but many others shared his wife's concerns, and some even hung banners calling for the impeachment of the judge. Meadows approached the mayor, asking if he had arranged for those impeachment banners. The mayor quickly denied it, mocking the judge for losing the people's trust. It turned out that one of the demands in Knox's petition was for the protective suit to go outside the silo to test the air for toxins. The judge had found this request reasonable, which was why she approved the hearing, but the mayor countered with the silo charter, claiming that such an act was strictly forbidden. Meadows was infuriated, saying, "Letting the residents search for the truth is the best way to release their frustration." The mayor, not wanting to continue the argument, still insisted on inviting the judge to dinner. He had already arranged the protective suit for her. Meadows checked the time and agreed to meet at 7 p.m. Meanwhile, Shirley and the others had arrived at their meeting point. As planned, they were to reach the Justice Department by 9 p.m. Besides them, Martha and the head of the Procurement Department were also involved. The Justice Department had only granted 4 spots for the hearing. Too many people would risk causing panic. Soon, 2 officers from the upper levels arrived to escort them. Shirley couldn't hide her displeasure, asking if they really needed to be watched just for climbing a few flights of stairs. The officers arrogantly explained they were here on orders to ensure their safety. At that moment, the sheriff was investigating the previous day's violent incident. Officer Hank had been at the scene and found it all rather suspicious. The throwing of firebombs and gunshots had happened too suddenly. What was even more unbelievable was that the Justice Department had taken the young mechanic's body on the spot. Hank, refusing to believe it, rushed to the morgue. There, he discovered another strange detail. The body of the retired commando who had shot the mechanic was also missing. His body had been in the morgue all night and had mysteriously disappeared. Hank called to check the records, and to his surprise, the commando's death had never been officially confirmed. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Hank recalled the location of the gunshot wound and realized that the commando must have been killed later. The sheriff quickly pieced it together. It was all part of a scheme orchestrated by the Justice Department. Back at the mayor's house, the judge arrived as promised, and the table was set with a lavish meal. Meadows was in a good mood. After eating and drinking, she eagerly requested to try on the protective suit, but to her surprise, the mayor remained seated, completely still. The judge's expression changed, and a sharp pain suddenly shot through her abdomen. The mayor admitted that he had poisoned her drink, explaining that her actions had begun to threaten the stability of the silo. The judge, in shock, burst into tears. She hadn't expected such cruelty from him. By now, she had no time for resentment. She just wanted to see the world outside the silo before she died. The mayor, of course, would never grant this request, but he had an alternative. He pulled out a VR headset from the cupboard and showed her footage from a 2018 biological preserve. The judge saw a variety of exotic animals, and the mayor enthusiastically described them. After removing the headset, the judge was already on the brink of death. Before death, she asked what humanity had done to lose such a beautiful world. Not long after, the mayor calmly opened the door and Robert entered. He was reminded to follow the plan, and the mayor quickly exited the room. Robert opened his bag to reveal a rusted dagger. Meanwhile, Knox and Shirley were nearing the Justice Department. The upper-level residents were furious, shouting that the lower-level residents didn't deserve to come up. They gathered by the stairs, blocking anyone from ascending. Fortunately, Knox and Shirley prepared. They threw a red ball down, signaling the lower-level maintenance workers to cut the power. The entire silo was plunged into darkness. This was the strength of the maintenance department. Panic swept through the residents. The mayor squeezed through the crowd, promising that if the power was restored, they would immediately be allowed to see the judge. Knox agreed and quickly threw down a green ball. Before long, the lights in the silo flickered back on. Under the mayor's lead, the residents parted to form a path toward the Justice Department. The mayor turned and demanded that only 2 people were allowed to enter. Knox and Shirley stepped forward without hesitation, walking through the long, dim corridor. But when they arrived at the office, they were stunned to find the judge already dead at her desk. Knox immediately realized they had walked straight into the mayor's trap. In Silo 17, Juliet was working on building an underwater breathing apparatus so she could reach the submerged fire service station. Little did she know Solo turned out to be such a chatterbox. He talked non-stop, like an annoying fly buzzing around her head. Frustrated, Juliet waved his bullshit off, signaling for some peace and quiet. She needed a material similar to a slate. At last, Solo found his moment to shine. He led Juliet into a classroom where a giant blackboard hung on the wall, telling her to take as much as she needed. But every time Solo spotted an object, he would recall a story about its former owner. Juliet's curiosity got the better of her. She wondered how he could know so much about them, because the rebellion happened when most of these people were barely 10 years old. Solo quickly changed the subject. He wandered over to a piano and suggested playing a song for her, but Juliet was still focused on her project. Any sound felt like noise at that point. Solo was visibly hurt. He had only wanted to impress her. Realizing she might have been too harsh, Juliet softened. She approached him and listened closely as Solo explained how the piano worked, that the sound came from air being pushed through the pipes by a bellows. Juliet's eyes lit up. She realized the same principle could work for her diving gear, and the piano's internal components were perfect for the job. As Juliet began assembling the device, Solo suddenly got restless. He insisted the basement door wasn't properly shut and wanted to go back and check. Juliet assured him that the door was closed, and even if it wasn't, no one else would be able to get in. Solo hesitated, then finally sat down to help her. Before long, the makeshift diving gear was complete. Juliet stressed that the bellows had to be pumped constantly to keep enough oxygen flowing through the tube. After securing a safety rope to herself and tying the other end to a heavy iron block, she was ready to dive. Using the weight to her advantage, Juliet quickly sank to the platform on the 23rd level. The oxygen tube kept her breathing underwater, but it wasn't long enough to reach the storage room ahead. Taking a deep breath, Juliet let go of the oxygen tube and swam toward the room. But disaster struck. The iron block got stuck on a steel pipe. Juliet panicked, tugging at the rope, but it wouldn't budge. Worse still, she wasn't close enough to the surface to swim back up. In a desperate move, she tore off a piece of metal from the platform and used it to slice through the rope. Finally, she broke through the water's surface, gasping for air. Regaining her strength, she stumbled toward the storage cabinet, slammed it open with sheer force, and retrieved the fireproof suit. Perhaps Solo had been alone for too long. When Juliet returned, he was already itching to go back to the basement. After several tries, he finally unlocked the passcode and disappeared inside. Juliet sat by the door, speaking calmly to him. She understood his fear and loneliness. Humans are social creatures. They need connection to survive. Eventually, the basement door creaked open. Solo emerged, looking like a guilty child who had been caught red-handed. Relieved, Juliet smiled and stood up. Back in Silo 18, Knox and Shirley knew they had been set up. They turned to leave, but strangely, no one stopped them. They made it down several levels before Robert suddenly appeared and addressed the crowd that the judge never wanted to deal with the lower-level residents. But to uphold the right of all residents to a fair hearing, she reluctantly agreed to the maintenance department's request. However, now that those from the maintenance tried to open the exit gate, the judge firmly refused and was brutally murdered for it. The crowd exploded in outrage. Fury turned to action as the residents vowed to make the maintenance department pay. Knox and Shirley from the lower-level maintenance department had fallen into the mayor's trap and were now being branded as murderers. Trapped in the mid to upper levels of the silo, their only way to escape danger was to return to the lowest levels. Martha had an idea. She knew a friend who could help, a porter living in the middle levels. Porters frequently transported goods between the lower and middle levels, so sneaking a few people down wouldn't be a problem. The porter agreed, but his payment request was unusual. He wanted some personal items that Juliet had used. Meanwhile, the real murderer, Bernard, paid a visit to Robert's home. Bernard had uncovered the truth. It was Robert who had orchestrated the impeachment of the judge. The mayor was deeply disappointed by his independent actions, but he also felt that letting Robert sit idle would be a waste of talent, so he decided to appoint him as the new chief judge of the Justice Department. After a hasty inauguration ceremony, the mayor headed to the Justice Department's surveillance center. The head of the strike team reported that he had planted an undercover operative among the residents between levels 60 and 130 to incite unrest. There was no way the fugitives from the maintenance department could hide for long, but the mayor wasn't satisfied. He issued a bounty of 1,000 credits for Knox and Shirley and ordered roadblocks to be set up on level 130, banning all traffic through the area. Just then, a report came in. The fugitives' location had been locked in. At that moment, the porter was casually fiddling with a wrench. Martha confidently claimed it was one of Juliet's tools. Over time, Juliet had become somewhat of a legend among the residents. Since the payment had been made, the group demanded that the porter provide them with disguises and a powered winch. But before the porter could respond, Knox burst into the room, warning that the strike team was coming. Everyone instantly realized the porter had sold them out, but there was no time to settle scores. They rushed out of the room. The materials manager suggested they split up. She and Martha were slower, and since Knox and Shirley were the ones with the bounty on their heads, it made sense for them to separate. After sending Knox and Shirley off, she urged Martha to leave as well, offering to stay behind and distract the strike team because the lower levels can survive without a materials manager, but not without a mechanic like Martha. Juliet's father was treating the wounded from the recent riots when two strike team members approached and told him the mayor wanted to see him. He followed them into the office. He assumed the mayor was about to threaten him, but to his surprise, the mayor took out a few of Juliet's personal belongings. According to protocol, these items were supposed to be circulated in the market, but given Juliet's reputation, they would likely become highly sought-after trophies, which could cause trouble. To avoid that, the mayor had decided to return them to Juliet's father. In return, the mayor wanted Juliet's father to take on a key leadership role. Juliet's father refused, saying the silo took his wife and son, and now it's taken his daughter too. He had nothing left to fear and nothing left to ask for. Feeling frustrated, the mayor returned to the surveillance center. This time, the strike team leader had some good news. They had captured the materials manager. The mayor's mood immediately lifted. He then summoned Lucas, a computer expert from the IT department who had once helped Juliet decrypt an antique hard drive. Lucas had been sentenced to 5 years of hard labor in the mines after the mayor had destroyed the drive in a fit of anger. But now, after everything that had happened, the mayor had begun to suspect that the hard drive might have held important secrets. He promised Lucas his freedom in exchange for restoring the lost data. Lucas knew this was a rare opportunity. He threw himself into the work and soon managed to recover part of the data. Among the recovered files was a blueprint of the silo's structure. It showed that the Justice Department and the IT department were both connected to an external network. Even more intriguing was a tunnel marked at the very bottom of the silo. Lucas also discovered a letter from a former head of the IT department. The letter's contents were cryptic, resembling some kind of code. The mayor's eyes gleamed with interest. On the other side, Knox and Shirley, determined to force their way downstairs, inevitably ran into an angry mob. The crowd was on a mission to capture the killers of Judge Meadows, and Knox and Shirley walked straight into the crosshairs. Left with no way out, they were forced to surrender. Just as things seemed hopeless, a woman stepped forward from the crowd. She claimed to be the wife of the newly appointed chief judge, Robert, and said she was acting under his orders to take the two fugitives into custody and deliver them to the Justice Department. The citizens, though suspicious, dared not challenge her authority and could only watch helplessly as Knox and Shirley were led away. Knox and Shirley were certain they were doomed, but to their surprise, Robert's wife led them into a blind spot in the surveillance system. After unlocking their handcuffs, she shoved them into a room in the Department of Cleaning. Just as they began to relax, the room's owner warned them not to underestimate Robert's wife. He said he wasn't helping them out of kindness or for a reward. He simply couldn't afford to say no to her. After this brush with death, Shirley realized how reckless her earlier actions had been. The people in the upper levels were far more dangerous and cunning than she had imagined. Knox agreed. This was exactly why he had always urged everyone to remain cautious and restrained. But now, with their backs against the wall, brute force might be their only way out. By this time, the roadblock on level 130 had been completed, cutting off all movement in both directions. Among those trying to slip through was Martha. Knox and Shirley decided not to try escaping downward. Instead, they would climb upward and fight back. Not long after, they tracked down the porter. This time they weren't interested in striking a fair deal. They used force to take the powered winch they needed for their escape. Disguised as porters, Knox and Shirley hurried toward the lower levels. Their suspicious behavior quickly caught the attention of the surveillance monitors. When they realized strike team members were closing in, Knox knew they had been compromised. He pulled out the powered winch and wrapped the rope around both of them. With a goose roar, they leapt into the void. The rope was just long enough to let them drop safely to the bottom of the silo. Workers from the maintenance department rushed to pull them to safety. The strike team fired at them in desperation, but their shots missed. The commotion alerted the residents near the roadblock, who joined forces to tear it down. In the chaos, Martha slipped through unnoticed and made her way downstairs. The mayor quickly learned of the failed operation and furiously berated the strike team leader, calling him useless. He immediately reassigned the mission to Sheriff Paul, giving him full authority to capture the fugitives from the maintenance department. Paul agreed respectfully, but internally he was seething. It turns out, a few days earlier, he and Officer Hank had been investigating the recent arson and riots. They discovered that several key witnesses had either died or vanished. It became clear that the Justice Department had played a shady role in the whole affair. Hank said that if someone had disappeared, there was only one place they could be hiding. The two of them headed to the restricted underground pit. As soon as they entered, they spotted fresh bloodstains on the ground. Sure enough, someone was hiding there. It was Patrick, who had thrown the Molotov cocktail during the riot. The man was visibly wary of the officers. Sensing his hesitation, Paul sent Hank away under the pretext of fetching medicine. Alone with the man, Paul demanded to know how much he really knew about the Justice Department. Patrick smiled bitterly, clutching his wound. He said he knew too much, and everything they had been told, it's all a lie. That's why he didn't trust anyone now. Paul hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was torn from a book found in Juliet's apartment. Patrick's eyes widened when he saw the drawing of green hills and blue skies. He immediately recognized Juliet's style and let down his guard. He asked the sheriff to bring him the best doctor available, promising to reveal everything he knew in exchange. Meanwhile, inside Silo 17, Juliet had finally managed to find a firefighting suit, but it was missing a helmet. She decided to find a protective helmet to substitute for it. While working alone, Juliet wondered if the generators in the lower levels were flooded, why there was still power in the middle and upper levels. Solo explained the IT department had a backup power system connected to an external source. That's why, when the uprising happened, the Justice Department blew up the underground pumps on level 144 and used the flood to wipe out the maintenance department. But the pumps were never repaired, so the floodwaters submerged the generators. The water level is still rising. In about 10 months, even the IT department will be underwater. Solo's expression brightened as he remembered Juliet was a mechanic. He told her to fix it and stop the flooding. Juliet shook her head, saying she needed to get back to Silo 18 as soon as possible since thousands of lives are at stake. With that, she prepared to search for a suitable helmet, but after taking just a few steps, a wave of dizziness washed over her. Solo thought she was hungry and ran to the storage room to find some food. Juliet steadied herself and pressed on. Before long, she arrived at the equipment room. Although Juliet didn't find the protective helmet, she did come across a record of the helmet being stolen. Based on the addresses on the list of suspects, Juliet decided to check one of the apartments. Unfortunately, after a quick search, she still couldn't find the helmet. However, she did find a photograph in a drawer with Solo's name engraved beneath it. The people in the photo were also IT apprentices, but the one looked nothing like Solo. Solo suddenly lost control of his emotions. Juliet immediately realized that he had probably stolen someone's identity. Not wanting to press the matter further, she grabbed her backpack and left the apartment. She headed to another suspect's apartment, but after another thorough search, she found nothing. Juliet felt a deep, inexplicable weariness. Her body could no longer keep up, and she collapsed onto the floor. At that moment, she seemed to realize something. She quickly ripped off the bandages around her wrist and discovered that the wound she'd gotten from the toxin had become infected and was now festering. As Juliet lay on the ground, she spotted the protective helmet was lying in the shadows. The scene shifts to Knox and Shirley finally managing to escape to the lower levels of the silo, having fought their way through multiple obstacles. Their reckless actions sparked a huge uproar, and the middle and upper level residents vowed to capture them, outraged by what they perceived as the murderers of Judge Meadows. Mayor Bernard went even further. He sealed off the staircase leading to the lower levels, effectively cutting off all supplies of food to the bottom. Even more sinister, he contacted his spies in the lower levels and ordered them to coat the stored food with rat poison. This meant that, starting today, the lower level residents would have no access to food. However, Knox wasn't just going to sit back and wait. First, he headed to the bustling manufacturing department, where workers were tirelessly crafting cold weapons. It seemed they had been planning a violent rebellion against against the pressure from the upper levels for some time. But the immediate concern was calming the growing panic among the lower-level residents. In a way, the mayor's blockade had already achieved its goal. Human beings have a natural fear of hunger, and the residents began to blame Knox and Shirley for the dire situation. They shouted at them to turn themselves in, demanding that they pay for their crimes. Shirley stood on the makeshift stage and tried to explain that she hadn't killed Judge Meadows. She insisted it was all part of a trap set by the mayor, but the residents weren't interested in the truth. They just wanted to be able to feed themselves and their families. At that moment, Martha stepped forward. Well respected in the lower levels, her words carried weight, and her speech had the power to rally the people. Martha argued that if they turned over Knox and Shirley now, next time it could be anyone in the crowd. As lower-level residents, they needed to unite if they wanted to put an end to the endless exploitation from the upper levels. With the crowd starting to calm down, Knox gave a subtle signal, and a cart loaded with food was wheeled in. He had secretly coordinated with an insider in the upper levels to have food sent down through the garbage pipes, along with a note saying that Juliet is alive. That simple message seemed to carry a kind of magic, bringing a glimmer of hope to those who had been on the brink of despair. Back in the surveillance room, the mayor soon received word about the food being secretly sent to the lower levels. His eyes gleamed as he quickly ordered a strike team to be placed at every garbage pipe. Fortunately, Knox had anticipated this move. The food they had received was only a temporary solution. They already had a long-term plan in place. With the roadblock at level 130, any movement upward was impossible. However, just a few floors higher lay large farms and orchards. If they could take control of that area, the lower-level residents would be able to sustain themselves. After lunch, Knox and his men arrived at the barricade. The guards were in a panic, quickly requesting backup from higher-ups. The strike team leader was also confused, wondering if the maintenance department was really planning a rebellion. Meanwhile, the newly appointed chief judge, Robert, received a report from a scout. The scout, located on the lower levels, had just received word that the maintenance department had gathered two groups of people heading in different directions. They were carrying a large number of weapons, including a power saw used for cutting cement. Robert was taken aback. It was clear that the maintenance department was planning something big. He decided to report this to the mayor, but after searching high and low, he couldn't find him. Frustrated, Robert turned to his wife, sharing his concerns. She shook her head and urged him to adjust to his new role. He was no longer just a strike team member, but a high-ranking judge, and matters like these were now handled by the right authorities. Robert reluctantly agreed, setting the issue aside for now. Not long after, the workers from the maintenance department on the lower levels cut through the roof panels, and Shirley led a group of people out of the materials department, which was located on the middle level. At the same time, the supervisor standing at the barricade received orders and immediately activated the steel cables fixed to the steps. The next moment, the barricade was forcefully pulled open, and Knox led the charge upward. Shirley raised her fist and shouted encouragement as the two groups converged. Before long, they had blocked the strike team members on the other side of the bridge. Knox made his demands, and the two sides agreed to use this as a new boundary, promising not to interfere with each other. The mayor, monitoring from the surveillance room, weighed the situation carefully. A confrontation would certainly lead to mutual destruction, and reluctantly, he agreed to the demand. This meant that the maintenance department had taken control of the large farms on the middle levels, and they no longer had to worry about food supplies. Meanwhile, Sheriff Paul had placed Patrick in the bottom-floor police station. The two had made a deal. If the sheriff helped treat Patrick's wounds, Patrick would reveal everything he knew. Unfortunately, the medical conditions on the lower levels were severely lacking. The only available doctor didn't even know how to use anesthetics, let alone remove the bullet lodged in Patrick's chest. With no other options, the sheriff sent a private message to his wife, asking her to arrange for a doctor to come down. Officer Hank felt uneasy, unsure of where the sheriff stood in all of this. After all, he had received orders from the mayor to capture Knox and Shirley. Paul didn't provide a clear answer, only stating that he would strictly adhere to the facts and the law. He then set out to investigate the truth in his own way. First, he approached Martha to find out what had happened on the day Judge Meadows died. However, Martha had an inherent distrust of anyone in uniform and didn't reveal anything. The only thing that concerned her was the materials manager who had been taken away that day. If they could track down his whereabouts, Martha might be willing to share some information. Meanwhile, the sheriff's wife, stationed in the upper levels, had already found Juliet's father. She quietly explained her request. There was an important patient in need of treatment on the lower levels, and this was a case that couldn't go through normal channels. Juliet's father understood the meaning behind her words. Since his daughter had been banished from the silo, his resentment had been growing, and without hesitation, he packed his tools and made his way down to the lower levels. He thought that, with the sheriff's commission, he could simply pass through the barricades. However, the guards refused to let him through. The sheriff's wife revealed her identity and falsely claimed that a pregnant woman on the lower levels was in labor. She warned that if anything happened to her, the officers would be violating Article 12 of the Silo Charter. After some back and forth, Juliet's father finally passed the barricades and rushed to the lower floor police station. He immediately began surgery on the injured man, skillfully removing the bullet from Patrick's chest. After that, all Patrick needed was to rest and recover. Paul, anxious and impatient, was relieved to have kept his promise. Now it was time for Patrick to tell the truth. Patrick kept his word and warned the sheriff to brace himself. He then shared everything: his joint experiences with Juliet, the video of the blue sky stored on the hard drive, all the way up to the persecution he suffered, and how Robert forced him to take the lead in causing trouble. He hadn't expected the new judge to be so ruthless. Not only did he fail to fulfill his promised benefits, but he also arranged for people to try and kill him to cover up the truth. Although the sheriff had been mentally prepared, he was still shocked by the brutal tactics of the Justice Department. After a long pause to compose himself, he went back to Martha and told her that the materials department manager had been arrested at a cafe, but there was no record of his detention at any of the police stations. The only possibility was that he had been taken by the Justice Department, where they held high-risk prisoners. Martha panicked and begged the sheriff to save the materials manager. He responded that the only way to help was to prove the manager's innocence. After much hesitation, Martha finally confessed the truth about Judge Meadows' death. It was all a trap orchestrated by the mayor. The sheriff didn't believe her one-sided account, so he went to the two involved parties. Shirley was adamant that Martha's words were true. After listening, the sheriff called the mayor, informing him that he was reopening the investigation into Meadows' death. The mayor turned pale, and he ordered his men to shut down the radio communications. At that moment, he realized that he had lost even the sheriff's support. His only remaining hope now might lie with the antique hard drive. Inside the drive was an encrypted letter from the previous IT supervisor. The mayor was convinced that it contained a huge secret, but unfortunately, the encryption was so complex that Lucas, the computer expert, couldn't make sense of it after hours of trying. Bernard noticed some familiar words and recognized the encryption method. It was an advanced code mentioned in the manager's legacy handbook. This was not information accessible to ordinary people. Gritting his teeth, the mayor decided to take Lucas on as his apprentice and forced him to swear an oath, promising never to reveal anything from the legacy handbook. Once that matter was handled, the mayor went to see Robert's wife. Knox and Shirley had almost been captured the day before, and it was thanks to Robert's wife that they were able to escape. She had already prepared her excuse. According to the Silo Charter, civilians were not allowed to punish criminals, which is why she intervened and helped the two escape. She then contacted the strike team to take over, and what happened afterward was unclear. The mayor was seething with frustration, unable to find any counter-arguments, and before leaving, he suddenly asked her if her husband knew what she had been up to. Meanwhile, Juliet's father knocked on Martha's door. It turned out that they had known each other for many years. He had come to express his gratitude. If it hadn't been for Martha replacing the insulating tape, Juliet would never have been able to climb that mountain. However, he still had one question. Did Juliet really die? Martha nodded, confirming that she couldn't have survived in such an environment. The man was overwhelmed with confusion. Knowing she would die, why did Martha help his daughter? Martha explained that Juliet didn't want anyone to watch her die on that hill. She wanted to plant a seed of hope for everyone in the silo. But the mayor, standing on the opposite side, didn't see it that way. He firmly believed that Juliet was the root of all the chaos. However, neither he nor Martha realized that the seed of hope and the source of chaos had both awakened within Silo 17. Thanks to the antibiotics stored by Solo, Juliet's wounds had nearly healed. She felt much lighter and declared she was going back to Silo 18 to save people. But Solo had hidden her protective suit, saying that only if Juliet repaired the water pump and stopped the water level from rising would he return her gear. In this post-apocalyptic world of scarce resources, Lucas would never expect he would walk into the high-tech, futuristic core basement. Not only did it house an AI computer, but the adjacent legacy room also displayed a giant planetary model, with the walls around it stacked high with books and historical artifacts. Bernard proudly introduced it all, claiming that these represented the entirety of human history and art. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. The real treasure was stored on the tablet. Lucas could hardly believe his ears, wondering if this little device was more powerful than a computer. It wasn't until Bernard gave a command to the tablet that the screen instantly displayed several books and documents. The mayor reminded his new apprentice to curb his curiosity. His primary task was to decrypt the letter left by the former IT supervisor. Meanwhile, Knox obtained a can of gunpowder. He cautiously made his way down to the lower platform, where Martha had already assembled a rocket-like device, ready to load the gunpowder into it. As the fuse was lit, a small missile shot straight into the sky. Upon reaching the top of the silo, it deployed a parachute, and as it descended, numerous scraps of paper shot out. The mayor, hearing the noise, rushed to the stairs and caught a note that fluttered down. The next moment, Shirley pulled the emergency switch, plunging the entire silo into darkness, except for the IT department, which remained lit. Bernard's face went pale. The residents of the upper floors were furious and demanded an explanation from the mayor. At the same time, Robert was also concerned about the safety of the silo. He felt it was necessary to remind the mayor that the newly appointed strike team leader was completely useless. But his wife immediately intervened, explaining that the power outage in the maintenance department was meant to show the public that when the IT department was connected to another power source, it would soon be restored. The silo itself wasn't really in danger. The only one truly in trouble was the mayor. Robert's wife suggested he wait for the mayor to come to him, as this would be more advantageous than going to him first. Indeed, the mayor was extremely busy at this moment. He went straight to the Justice Department's prison, hoping to extract information about the gunpowder from the materials manager. In this post-apocalyptic world, gunpowder was a deadly weapon that could destroy the entire silo. But the materials manager had already resigned herself to death, insisting that the mayor guarantee the safety of the other 3 people who had come up with her before she would reveal anything about the gunpowder. Naturally, the mayor refused the condition and turned away. The next moment, he arrived at the police station office and declared that their sheriff had been kidnapped on the lower levels. To prevent further trouble from the maintenance department, he had cut off all radio communications. At this point, one of the officers raised a question. The note claimed that the IT department had lied, and they wanted Bernard to explain. Bernard lied without flinching, claiming that the maintenance department controlled all the power in the silo, so it wasn't difficult for the IT department to be powered independently for a few minutes. But this weak explanation only made the officers more suspicious. However, the mayor didn't seem to care about this. His top priority was still finding the source of the gunpowder. He decided to conduct a full investigation into the materials department, but the strike team leader replied that the search warrant was still pending the chief judge's signature. Bernard was furious and nearly lost his temper. He stormed into the Justice Department and found Robert pointing his finger in the man's nose and chastising him, telling him not to forget who appointed him as chief judge. Now, all he needs to do is sit at the desk and follow his orders. But Robert didn't want to become a puppet like the previous chief judge. He had worked diligently in the strike team for over a decade, only to never become Bernard's apprentice. He criticized the mayor for having poor judgment in people. Bernard gritted his teeth, revealing that the reason he hadn't chosen Robert was that he lacked a spirit of exploration. As a candidate for IT supervisor, one had to be curious about everything. Now, the two were completely at odds. Before leaving, the mayor couldn't resist taking one last jab at Robert, saying it was his wife who let the materials manager and others go. Robert's heart sank. He hadn't expected his wife to be hiding something from him. No wonder she had tried to stop him from meeting with the mayor that morning. His wife had already anticipated this moment and explained that she had helped the maintenance department to bet on both sides, ensuring that she wouldn't end up on the losing side no matter who won. Robert's anger gradually faded. He only hoped that his wife wouldn't hide things from him in the future. In the legacy room, the apprentice Lucas certainly didn't disappoint. He finally cracked the encryption on the letter left by the former IT supervisor. It turned out that the letters represented book page numbers, and in order to see the actual content, one had to find the corresponding books. However, despite searching through the entire legacy room, Lucas couldn't find the right books. Mayor Bernard speculated that the former IT minister had intended for the encrypted letter to be found, so it was unlikely that the books in the legacy room were involved. He remembered the late Judge Meadows' favorite book was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It made sense. Meadows was the intended recipient of the encrypted letter, and she had a special fondness for this book. On the lower level, Paul and Hank found Knox and Shirley, accusing them of being too extreme in their actions. Shirley defended them, saying they only wanted to win people's support and had not harmed anyone. But Knox's tongue was sharp, accusing them of wasting time and suggesting they should focus on finding out who had poisoned their food with rat poison instead. The two officers were left speechless, and the next moment, they actually went off to investigate the poisoner. Officer Hank's first suspicion was the trash room manager. With the stairwells between the upper and lower levels sealed off, the trash chute had become the only way for spies to receive instructions. The manager, unable to withstand the pressure, finally admitted that notes from the Justice Department appeared periodically in certain areas, though he didn't know who was leaving them. To add weight to his confession, the manager claimed he had just received a new instruction that day. Hearing this, the two officers rushed to warn Knox and Shirley that the Justice Department was planning to assassinate them. For safety's sake, Hank locked them in the police station's jail while he himself set off to hunt for the spy. After investigating the trash room, Hank began to question the cafeteria staff, as it was the most likely place the poisoning had occurred. His perseverance paid off when, after gathering all the testimonies, they zeroed in on a particular cook as the main suspect. The cook quickly cracked under pressure, but before she could be taken away, she was surrounded by an angry crowd. Hank discovered the reason for the cook's betrayal. Her mother was ill and being treated in the upper-level medical department. The Justice Department had used her mother's illness as leverage to force the cook to act as their mole. Hank didn't press further. He simply ordered the cook to stay at home and do menial work. In the end, it seemed that the people from the lower levels were far more civilized in their approach than those from the upper levels. Meanwhile, Juliet, inside Silo 17, had her protective suit hidden by Solo. She had no choice but to compromise and agreed to help him stop the water level from rising further. Juliet quickly came up with a plan. She would find a waterproof cable to channel power from the IT department to the pumping station on the 8th floor. The solution seemed simple, but in reality, it was a huge challenge. With a sorrowful face, Solo begged Juliet to hurry, as he couldn't wait to put his prepared equipment to use. In addition to the waterproof cable, he had also made an escape bell. Once Juliet turned on the pump, she could shake the rope, and Solo would use the winch to pull her back up. After hearing him ramble on, Juliet's head was buzzing with frustration. She irritably suggested that Solo should get into the water to start the pump himself, but he immediately switched to his usual pitiful mode. Juliet rolled her eyes and, ignoring him, tied the rope herself. Solo handed her a pair of weighted shoes to help her sink more quickly to the bottom. Next, he pulled out a diving mask made from safety goggles. Juliet was somewhat touched and reminded him to keep an eye on the cable. She then descended into the water, using the rope to guide herself. Thanks to her previous diving experience, she made it to the 8th floor pump room without difficulty. She secured the safety rope to a railing, pushed through a heavy door, and finally squeezed into the mechanical room. Together, they managed to get the long dormant pump working again. After completing the task, Juliet turned to swim back toward the safety rope. She signaled for Solo to pull her up, but after waiting for what felt like an eternity, there was no response from above. She reluctantly undid the safety lock, planning to swim up herself, only to accidentally let go of the rope, which fell to the bottom. To make matters worse, the air supply from the pipe was cut off as well. Juliet was horrified and quickly removed the weighted shoes, scrambling upward along the air pipe. But her progress was agonizingly slow. Desperate, she finally let go of the rope and used her buoyancy to propel herself upward. Just before the oxygen ran out, she managed to break the surface and narrowly escaped. However, she wasn't feeling victorious. Solo still hadn't responded, suggesting something might have happened to him. In Silo 18, Martha was constantly worried about the materials manager who had been captured. She sought out Paul once again, asking if there was any way to rescue her, even if it was just to send a message. The sheriff explained that the Justice Department's prison was heavily guarded, and no one could get near. Furthermore, both radio and computer communications were down, so the sheriff had no way of contacting anyone above. Martha, anxious, could only return home and try to come up with a solution herself. As she looked at the camera on her desk, an idea suddenly flashed in her mind. She connected the camera's power and shook it in front of the lens. Sure enough, it didn't take long before the surveillance room on the upper levels noticed the camera being rebooted. They flagged Martha's image for investigation. Before long, an astonishing discovery was made. It turned out that Martha and the materials manager had an unusual relationship. They had divorced 25 years ago. Bernard was ecstatic, as he had finally found a breakthrough in questioning the materials manager. Meanwhile, Juliet had arrived at the walkway where the compressor was placed. A sense of foreboding rose in her. Solo had indeed vanished, and there were bloodstains all all over the place. Juliet immediately suspected that someone else had entered. She grabbed an axe from the ground and followed the trail of blood. Suddenly, a sharp ringing sound filled her ears. At first, she didn't pay much attention, but as she walked, she began to feel an inexplicable soreness in her lower back. She quickly remembered Solo's warning. If you stay underwater for too long and then ascend quickly, your body can't adjust to the sudden change in pressure, and if it's severe enough, you might even die. Juliet realized she couldn't afford to ignore it, so she abandoned her investigation and hurriedly made her way to the air pipe, pulling on it to dive back into the water. She followed Solo's advice, staying underwater for a while to allow her body to adjust to the pressure. After a while, she slowly surfaced, and the soreness was gone. Juliet picked up her weapon again and headed back up. Suddenly, she heard a sharp knock from behind. Her heart sank, and she shouted toward the quiet area, claiming she was just an ordinary passerby and would leave as soon as she retrieved what Solo had hidden. The lights suddenly flickered on, and a figure coldly replied that Solo was dead. If she didn't leave, she would die there too. Juliet tried to explain, but before she could say anything, an arrow shot out, piercing her chest. Fortunately, the assailant didn't pursue further. Juliet took cover behind a stone pillar, pulled the arrow from her chest with great effort, and then made her way to the nearest medical room. Despite the setback, Juliet didn't give up. After treating her wound, she made her way to the broken bridge. From a distance, she spotted a figure lying on the ground and thought it was Solo. But just as she got closer, the figure suddenly jumped up, and Juliet realized she had fallen into an ambush. Fortunately, the attacker wasn't very strong, and Juliet managed to overpower the person using her agility. When she pulled off the hood, she was shocked to find a delicate face underneath. Suddenly, two figures holding bows and arrows appeared, shouting at her. Back in Silo 18, Mayor Bernard learned of the relationship between Martha and the materials manager, and an idea for dealing with the lower-level resistance quickly formed in his mind. He sneaked into the water pump room on the 90th floor. Meanwhile, the core members of the maintenance department on the lower levels were meeting at Martha's home, discussing their next move. They felt they needed to visit the materials department and medical department on the middle levels to collect some essential supplies. Martha, however, looked down on these simple-minded individuals. With the upper and middle levels under martial law, any action would be doomed to fail. Instead, she thought it would be better to focus on rescuing her former materials manager. After venting her frustration, she sent everyone out of the room. At that moment, Martha's computer received a message, and shortly afterward, she packed her things and headed for the upper levels. Shirley, puzzled, asked where she was going. Martha explained that the water pump on the 90th floor was broken, and someone had requested her to come and fix it. Shirley suspected it was a trap, but Martha had her own plans and insisted on going. After bypassing the heavily guarded checkpoints, she finally reached the water pump room on the 90th floor. The moment Martha opened the door, the mayor's figure appeared in front of her. She was slightly surprised, but quickly regained her composure. The moment she rebooted the camera, she had already suspected that someone would come looking for her. The mayor fiddled with the water pump switch, indicating that there was no malfunction. He simply wanted to meet with Martha, and soon after, he brought up the topic of the materials manager. The mayor knew this was Martha's weak spot, and seeing her react so emotionally, he finally revealed his true nature. He demanded that Martha become his informant, reporting any rebellious actions from the maintenance department, or else the materials manager would endure endless suffering. Death would be a luxury for them. Martha was torn, but when the image of the dying materials manager appeared before her, her mental defenses crumbled. The mayor seized the opportunity, promising that if she cooperated, the materials manager would be freed once the chaos subsided. Martha cursed him as despicable, but she agreed to the mayor's deal. That night, a few brave warriors from the maintenance department quietly scaled the rope and bypassed the guards' blockade. They planned to steal some medical supplies, but as soon as they pried open the main door, they were surrounded by a large number of strike team members. The maintenance department's theft plan was a complete failure. Unaware of the truth, Shirley went alone to the underground restricted area. She followed in the footsteps of her predecessors, engraving the name of the late comrade on the wall. Who knew how many more names would be added to that wall after today? After finally calming herself, Shirley went to find the sheriff, who was eating. With the mayor's underhanded methods now exposed, Shirley hoped Paul would use his power as sheriff to imprison the mayor. The sheriff, however, shook his head, explaining that without solid evidence, he didn't have the authority to do so, according to the silo charter. Shirley, frustrated, didn't want to continue debating with this stubborn man. Before she left, she told him he would stand up and expose the mayor's lies one day. Meanwhile, the new apprentice Lucas entered Judge Meadows' residence and found two staff members sorting items. He showed his ID badge, and their attitude changed instantly. They exchanged a glance before obediently leaving the room. Lucas wasted no time. grabbing a book from the shelf and beginning to decode the encrypted letter left by the former IT supervisor. He had previously studied a lot of material in the core basement and speculated that the encryption was related to a book left by the former IT supervisor. The mayor suspected that it was most likely The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a book beloved by Judge Meadows. But after Lucas spent a long time comparing, he realized the encrypted material didn't correspond to that book, and none of the books in his own home matched either. Reluctantly, he decided to investigate the former IT supervisor's descendants. Not long after, Lucas knocked on the door of a residence on the middle levels, where the direct descendants lived. The family's hostile attitude became evident, so Lucas flashed his ID badge again, and it worked like a charm. He walked straight into the room and bluntly asked whether the unauthorized books collected by the former IT supervisor had ended up with them. The man denied it, claiming all the books had been burned during the rebellion and there was no way they had them. Lucas threatened that he would send a search team from the Justice Department. The man's family panicked and hurried after Lucas, urging him not to be so harsh so soon in his new position. They had made considerable efforts to sever their ties with the former supervisor, and this revelation touched Lucas's heart. Historical records indicated that the former IT supervisor had wiped the servers and destroyed the books during his tenure, which led to deep hatred from the residents of the silo. However, the mayor had claimed that the former IT supervisor was one of the most successful supervisors in history because before his leadership, there was a rebellion every 20 years, and during the most dangerous times, the airlocks were opened and the 10,000 residents were at risk of being killed by toxic gas. The former IT supervisor had learned from these historical lessons and realized the cause of the uprisings was people knowing too much. To solve this, he decided to cut off the silo's connection to history. He revoked access to the server and destroyed all the books, blaming everything on the rebels. Lucas was skeptical, believing that people who knew the truth would eventually share it. But then the mayor revealed an astonishing secret. The former IT supervisor had used a chemical compound that gradually caused people to lose parts of their memory. In fact, the plan had worked, and the silo had been peaceful for 140 years. Robert received a report from two of his men. The new IT apprentice had broken into Judge Meadows' home. Robert was curious about what Lucas was up to, but the strike team leader refused to disclose any information, as Robert was no longer the strike team leader and wasn't his superior anymore. Not long after, Robert's wife found the strike team leader. Seemingly casually, she mentioned his past relationship with Robert and then shifted the conversation, pointing out that Lucas had been working in the mines just recently. With the silo on the brink of rebellion, she urged the strike team leader to support Robert as their goals aligned. The stubborn strike team leader finally relented and back in his office sent Robert a message, arranging to meet in the orchard where his father was buried. He relayed Lucas's recent movements in detail, though he was unsure of his intentions. Robert, however, expressed his sincere thanks. The strike team leader, seemingly unimpressed, claimed that this was simply repaying a past favor, and from that moment on, they were even. Robert didn't dwell on the strike team leader's words, but immediately sought out Lucas. When he learned that Lucas had been running errands for the mayor, Robert warned him that once the mayor got what he wanted from him, he'd toss him back into the mines. When Lucas remained unmoved, Robert used a more personal tactic, asking if his mother was working in the medical department on level 85. Lucas froze for a moment, then quietly walked away. It wasn't long before Lucas found himself at the home of the former IT supervisor's descendant. After apologizing for his previous behavior, Lucas sincerely expressed his respect for the former IT supervisor, calling him a hero of the silo, and explained that what he was searching for now had to do with the silo's safety. The man and his family were moved by his words and revealed that the late Judge Meadows had visited them for the same reason. She had traded 2 books to acquire an antique book that had been passed down through their family. The books turned out to be old versions of the Silo Charter. Lucas quickly realized that these books were easy to find. He raced back to Meadows' house, retrieved one, and began translating using the cipher in the letter. The first 2 lines of the message sent a chill down his spine all the way to his smelly butt. He was told that if he had come this far, he should know the game had been manipulated. It was clear that the rest of the message would reveal the brutal truth about the silo. The letter revealed that the founders had built 50 silos, which made Lucas immediately think that Juliet might still be alive. The mayor knew these details well. Strictly speaking, there were 51 silos, and Juliet had indeed entered another one. However, the communication video on the helmet soon cut off, and they couldn't confirm her status. Bernard expressed some disappointment, but continued, explaining that he had known all of this long ago. He instructed Lucas to keep decoding the remaining contents. Lucas returned to his work and soon managed to translate all the information. In addition to the 50 silos, the founders had created a safeguard, and the letter suggested that if Lucas didn't believe it, he should go to the lowest level of the silo and look for a hidden passage. Lucas was certain the mayor didn't know about this, and he wanted to report it to him immediately. But when he approached the strike team leader, he was scolded harshly. The mayor had urgent matters to attend to, and Lucas had to wait. Frustrated and angry, Lucas decided to go to the lower levels on his own. The scene shifts to the desolate 17th silo where one survivor and his wife had been barely scraping by for years. They had taken in an orphan and had 2 children of their own, but dwindling supplies made life increasingly difficult. One day, they unexpectedly found a stranger in the silo. Seeing the intruder in a protective suit, the wife instinctively wanted to eliminate him. She quickly retrieved her long unused weapons and was just in time to see the intruder hanging by a rope. Without hesitation, she cut the rope, thinking she had doomed the fallen Juliet. But her husband, feeling a sudden pang of empathy, quietly threw a bucket into the water. This was the scene shown from the beginning. The couple argued bitterly, with the man believing that no innocent life should be harmed without reason, and that the intruder would leave on his own in time. However, Juliet didn't leave. Instead, she convinced Solo from the basement to come out, and the woman's bloodthirsty desire to eliminate her flared up again. It turns out that as Juliet submerged to repair the water pump, the woman and her husband quickly overpowered the solitary Solo. However, her husband didn't kill him. Instead, he planned to force Solo to open the vault door, ensuring their family wouldn't have to worry about food anymore. But the couple hadn't anticipated that Solo's resolve was tougher than stone. He'd rather die than reveal the vault's lock code. Just then, Juliet, wounded by an arrow, returned. The couple's adopted daughter disguised herself as a corpse to ambush Juliet. However, Juliet quickly countered the attack. Facing the deadly arrows, Juliet desperately explained that all she wanted was to meet Solo, and once she got what she needed, she'd leave immediately. The man then proposed a deal. If she opened the vault door, she could do whatever she wanted. With no other option, Juliet reluctantly agreed to the seemingly impossible task. To the couple's surprise, their adopted daughter also eagerly followed, determined to enter the vault as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, in Silo 18, Sheriff Paul finally realized that Bernard was unfit to be the mayor of the silo. He openly admitted that ever since meeting Juliet, he had been driven by a desire to uncover the truth. Knox was overjoyed by the sheriff's involvement, knowing they urgently needed to find the traitor on the lower levels. If they didn't, news of their raid on the supply department would leak. Officer Hank believed they would need to ally with a high-ranking official. Both Knox and Shirley thought of a suitable candidate. It's Robert's wife, who had once let them go. Unfortunately, communications were cut off, and contacting her was now nearly impossible. After their discussions bore no fruit, Knox entered Martha's room, having heard that she hadn't left her quarters in days. Martha explained that she was simply too worried about the imprisoned materials manager. Knox firmly reassured her that they would rescue her now that Sheriff Paul was their ally. Upon hearing this, Martha's expression grew complicated. She was, in fact, the traitor everyone was looking for. Their entire conversation was overheard by the mayor. As Knox stepped out of the room, the mayor's reminder flashed on the computer screen. Ensure the cameras are always on and never leave the room. Martha's face showed frustration, while Lucas had already returned home. He handed his mother the old version of the silo charter, asking her to keep it safe before heading to the checkpoint leading to the lower levels. Presenting himself as an IT apprentice, the guards didn't question him too much and quickly escorted him to the other side. However, the maintenance department had people stationed there. Sensing Lucas's unusual identity, they were about to throw him over the side. In a panic, Lucas mentioned Juliet's name. The 3 guards froze, and soon after, Shirley from the maintenance department arrived. Lucas seized the opportunity, desperately shouting that Juliet might still be alive. But to get more information, Shirley must take him to the bottom of the silo. Meanwhile, Bernard had arrived at the police station to officially strip Paul of his position as sheriff, citing his involvement in planning the theft of explosives from the supply department. The officers fell silent, clearly skeptical of the reasoning. Paul, still unaware of his demotion, tried to pass a note to the guard at the checkpoint. Shortly after, Robert himself arrived, just as the guards turned out to be his loyal supporters. Paul handed over a folded note stating he needed to speak with Robert's wife. Upon returning, Robert read the note, and the sight of a picture of blue skies sparked his curiosity about the outside world. After some discussion, Robert decided he would find a way to obtain the key to the vault, the true treasure of any ruler. His wife would secretly maintain contact with the maintenance department, while Paul's successful contact with Robert inspired Knox. How had the spies on the lower levels been able to warn them so quickly before they raided the material department? Hank pointed out that for such rapid communication, the only options were either walkie-talkies or computers. Knox's eyes lit up at this realization. The next moment, he walked into Martha's room, now knowing who the spy was. The mayor and Martha both froze, and it wasn't until Knox mentioned another name that they breathed a sigh of relief. Knox's eyes gleamed with cunning as he laid out the next steps in their rebellion plan. In Silo 17, Juliet was still searching for clues about the vault lock code. As she passed two bodies, the girl stepped forward to offer an explanation. The two bodies were the woman's parents, who had broken into the vault a few years ago to crack the code, only to be killed by Solo. No wonder the woman hated Juliet so much. The resentment in Juliet's heart eased a little as she turned to rummage through a wardrobe. To her surprise, she found a protective suit inside. She quickly hid her shock, grabbed the suit, and left with the girl, heading next door to the classroom. The woman's dead parents had once entered the vault, so the door code must have some kind of pattern. Juliet meticulously calculated using the information she had found, finally coming up with two sets of numbers. Unfortunately, the lock rejected them. Juliet didn't get discouraged, however. She remembered how much Solo had cared about her identity as an IT apprentice, and how familiar he seemed with the classroom environment. Suddenly, an idea hit her. She quickly asked the girl when the rebellion had occurred. The girl replied that even her foster mother had been just a child at that time. Juliet's suspicions were confirmed. During the rebellion, Solo had been just a child in the classroom. On one of the desks, she found Solo's real last name. A flicker of excitement passed through Juliet. She hurriedly found the man and told him that if she could meet Solo, she could open the vault door. When the man saw their adopted daughter holding up a relic of her mother, he finally relented and agreed to take Juliet to Solo's cell. Though Solo's face was covered in blood, he stubbornly declared that no one would enter the vault, as it was a promise he had made to his mentor. But Juliet firmly stated that he was not the IT supervisor's apprentice. He was his son. Solo's face showed shock. Just then, the woman appeared with a bow and arrow. She demanded to know how her parents had died. Solo trembled, explaining that he had been forced into everything. When the woman's parents had entered the vault, they found a gun by the door. After shooting Solo, they had entered the food storage room. But Solo, miraculously surviving, locked them inside, and they suffocated to death. To prove his story, Solo showed them the scars on his stomach. With the hatred between them eased, Juliet continued to counsel him. When she mentioned that he was only 12 during the rebellion, Solo suddenly remembered how he had just been sent into the vault by his father, only to witness his father being killed. Juliet quickly analyzed the situation, explaining that the IT supervisor had told him to never open the door. He had just wanted to protect his son, not prevent anyone from entering. At the time, Solo had been too young and deeply traumatized, so he had stubbornly followed that instruction as a commandment. Juliet urged him to put himself in the woman's shoes. They both had children and wanted them to survive. Finally, Solo relented, and they all went into the vault, where they found a treasure trove of supplies. Juliet and the others were like curious children, marveling at the historical relics around them. Solo handed out ice cream and even revealed a protective suit hidden under a chessboard. Juliet playfully scolded him, noting that there was another spare suit at the IT supervisor's house. Solo laughed, admitting that he knew the secret, but quickly realized what Juliet had done. She could have simply taken the protective suit and left, but instead, she had returned to rescue him. Meanwhile, Shirley had taken Lucas to the restricted area at the bottom of the silo. Peering down, Lucas saw that the area below was filled with dark, stagnant water. He guessed that a pump must be in place to keep the water level so low, and he knew he had to go down and check. Shirley thoughtfully handed him a long rope. Lucas explained his theory that Juliet might still be alive. Then he climbed down the rope, only to find that the water barely reached his waist. Excited, Lucas looked around and soon spotted a tunnel in the wall. He eagerly walked into it, but soon found his path blocked by a steel door. Voices came from behind the door, and Lucas explained that he had been instructed by the former IT supervisor. The voices on the other side became serious and said that only 3 people had come here: former IT supervisor, Judge Meadows, and Juliet's boyfriend. However, her boyfriend had no permission to open the communication. The voice told Lucas that he would soon receive an instruction just like Meadows, and if he shared this conversation with anyone, the safeguard plan would be triggered. Knox, the head of the maintenance department, called a meeting with the core members. Their supplies were running out, and the farm they had occupied could be reclaimed at any moment. Knox decided to launch a counterattack immediately. He and Shirley would lead a team to assault the barricades and hold off the strike team for 3 hours, while the others used that time to blow up the generator on the lower levels. The sheriff opposed this all-or-nothing approach, insisting that he only wanted the truth. Knox, however, was adamant. If they didn't go all the way, would the truth ever come out? Everyone fell silent. But little did they know, every word and action was being closely monitored by the mayor. He quickly dispatched all strike team members to ensure the safety of the generator. At the barred barricades leading to the lower levels, the guards suddenly heard the sound of a metal barrel hitting the ground. Before they could make sense of the situation, a massive oil barrel fell from the upper levels, destroying the barricade in an instant. A wave of strike team members stormed down. The maintenance department's members were in a panic. Before they had even launched their plan, the strike team had arrived at their doorstep. Knox was forced to act quickly, grabbing a weapon and charging toward the fully armed enemies. But it was a futile attempt, like throwing eggs at rocks. He was quickly captured. Meanwhile, all the maintenance department staff and key members hiding inside were rounded up, caught in a sweep. In the control room, the mayor let out a long sigh of relief. The suppression operation had gone much smoother than expected. Now, they just had to ensure the safety of the generator. Robert and his wife were filled with dread. They had just helped the lower levels communicate with the maintenance department, only to see it fall so quickly. Robert was deeply worried that the mayor would take revenge on them, but his wife felt things weren't as simple as they seemed. At that moment, most of the maintenance department's traitors were locked up in the cafeteria. As someone was smashing things, they accidentally discovered that the display showing the outside world was just a giant screen. Now they were even more convinced that the higher-ups had been lying to them all along. In the crowd, Shirley ran into Lucas. She was eager to know what Lucas had discovered at the lowest levels, but Lucas's eyes lacked their usual spark. He explained that he had overheard details about the safeguard protocol at the iron door on the lower levels. Lucas had originally planned to return to the upper levels and tell the mayor what he had learned, but then he was caught up in the rebellion and thrown into the cafeteria with the rest. Before long, Knox, Paul, and other key members of the maintenance department were dragged out and thrown into the heavily guarded police station prison. It was at this time that the undercover identity of Martha was exposed. According to their previous agreement, she and the materials manager were supposed to be granted freedom, but the materials manager declared that she would rather remain in prison than associate with a traitor like Martha. Martha didn't bother explaining. She simply turned, slinging her bag over her shoulder, and headed toward the mayor's office. Seeing the smug smile on the mayor's face, Martha couldn't help but caution him not to get too confident. But Bernard remained calm and collected. The strike team had already secured the generator, and as long as they dismantled the explosives set by the maintenance department, everything would be over. He invited Martha to sit down and wait. Soon, the mayor received more good news. The explosives attached to the generator didn't have any detonating wires. They could simply follow the procedure and remove them safely. Martha's expression remained unchanged as she began to tell a story. Because the noise from the generator was so loud, Martha had invented a set of sign language. After learning it, the maintenance department's workers could communicate with each other even without speaking. The mayor's face changed as he realized that the conversations he had overheard through the surveillance were just a smokescreen. In reality, Martha and the others had already known about the surveillance through their sign language. Meanwhile, the only person on the lower levels who hadn't been captured was Juliet's father, a doctor. He claimed he needed to go to the medical department on the upper levels for surgery. With the help of a guard, he successfully passed through the barriers set by the strike team. Upon reaching the middle-level stairs, Juliet's father signaled for everyone to stop, and a few strike team members left. It turned out they were all Robert's loyal confidants. In the next instant, the injured man on the stretcher sat up. It was Hank, and where he had been lying, a layer of explosives was spread out, revealing their plan to destroy the stairway. Juliet's father, however, tragically realized that in his rush, he had lost the timer on the stretcher. Now, they had no choice but to manually detonate the explosives. The old man had made up his mind. He took off his watch and handed it to Hank, asking him to pass it on to Juliet if she was still alive. After Hank left, the old man grabbed the fuse attached to the explosives. Meanwhile, Martha had already begun her countdown in front of the mayor, but when she reached 0, nothing happened. Instead, a subordinate arrived to report that the explosives on the generator had been safely removed. Bernard laughed triumphantly. However, just then, a massive explosion rang out from a nearby floor. Juliet's father had detonated the explosives, and the shockwave destroyed the stairway between the 90th and 92nd floors. Bernard finally understood the true plan of the maintenance department. At that moment, all of his strike team members were deployed to the lower levels, and they wouldn't be able to provide backup anytime soon. At the same time, the prison doors holding the key members of the maintenance department were opened by officers. It turned out they were all loyal to the sheriff. Having received a note from Robert earlier, they had played along with the entire charade. Freed, Knox and the others quickly rushed to the cafeteria. With the help of a few inside informants, they successfully rescued the remaining members of the maintenance department. With the loss of the strike team, they now controlled the middle and upper levels. Bernard, feeling deeply defeated, could only watch in impotent rage. At that moment, apprentice Lucas approached him. Disregarding the warning sounds of the iron gate, Lucas revealed information about the safeguard protocol. This was Lucas's final repayment for Bernard promoting him. After that, there were no more ties between them. Lucas just wanted to spend his remaining time with his family. Hearing this news, Bernard's face turned ashen, and like a walking corpse, he climbed the stairs. He bumped into Robert, who had long coveted the position of IT supervisor. Bernard, anticipating this, offered to take Robert on as an apprentice and handed him the key and code to the core bunker. Robert, still confused, immediately headed to Lucas's house. He wanted to know what message had caused Bernard to lose his will to fight. Lucas, remembering the warning from the gate, revealed nothing about the safeguard procedure. Instead, he subtly suggested to Robert that he should check out the core bunker. It might hold the answers he was seeking. Robert, following his advice, took his wife and child to the bunker. But when they announced their identities, the AI allowed Robert and his son to leave, but insisted that only his wife could stay. Meanwhile, the mayor walked with his small bag toward the exit. He passed through the top-level cafeteria and soon reached the department that managed the main exit. He pulled out his gun, ordering everyone to leave, leaving only one guard to accompany him. At this moment, Martha finally reunited with the main group, and her misunderstandings with her lover were resolved. The lower-level residents surged toward the exit, convinced that the toxic world outside the silo had been fabricated by the management. Today, they were determined to breathe the fresh air of freedom. The few remaining upper-level residents in the cafeteria were unable to stop the force of the crowd. Sheriff Paul stepped forward, trying to persuade the mayor to abandon resistance, saying people only wanted the truth, but soon he was carried away by the angry crowd. In such a situation, no one had the patience for negotiations. Amid the shouts, they wheeled out a battering ram, intending to forcibly break open the door to the outside world. At that moment, a figure appeared on the cafeteria screen, causing everyone to stop. When the figure drew closer to the camera, they recognized her. It was Juliet. The crowd erupted in cheers. Their idol, Juliet, was alive after all. The deafening cheers were heard even by the mayor, who was in the room. He approached the screen and saw Juliet pull out a cloth with words written on it, warning them not to go outside. After giving the warning, Juliet was about to force open the door, but to her surprise, the iron gate opened on its own. As she descended toward the bunker, she encountered Bernard, who was wearing a protective suit. Learning that Juliet had come back to save everyone, Bernard twisted with rage. He told her that everything she had done was in vain, just like himself. He had given so much for the silo, only to realize in the end how laughable it all was. Juliet blurted out, asking if it was because of the safeguard procedure. Bernard was shocked, since he had only just learned from Lucas about the so-called safeguard procedure, which allowed certain individuals to kill everyone inside the silo at any time if they wished. Juliet shook her head, insisting that she had a way to stop it. It turns out that earlier, when she helped Solo resolve his long-held grudges back in Silo 17, he had decided to join her in heading to Silo 18, as there just so happened to be 2 sets of gas masks. However, before leaving, Solo wanted to visit his home. The familiar decor in the living room slowly triggered his forgotten memories. Juliet, anxious, urged him to hurry up. Just as they were leaving the room, Solo noticed a note on the table. The words "safeguard procedure" made his face change instantly. He rushed after Juliet, revealing that he had overheard his parents talking about it when he was a child. When a rebellion occurred in the silo, the so-called safeguard procedure would be activated. The toxic gas released would be enough to kill everyone inside. Fortunately, his father, the IT supervisor, knew about this and, together with his mother, stopped the safeguard procedure. Otherwise, everyone in the silo would have perished before they could even escape. Juliet was shaken to the core upon hearing this. She feared that the rebellion in Silo 18 might also trigger the safeguard procedure. Thankfully, Solo had a blueprint of the silo at home. Juliet quickly found a pipe leading outside on level 14, and it turned out to be the place where Solo's mother worked. It was clear that this was the pipe through which the toxic gas would be released when the safeguard procedure was activated. Juliet was horrified. She needed to return to Silo 18 as quickly as possible and seal the pipe before the rebellion began. However, when they returned to the core bunker, they found that the protective suit they had taken from the IT supervisor's house had been chewed up by rats. To make matters worse, the remaining fire suit had mysteriously disappeared. Juliet rushed outside to search for it. She then saw Solo walking out of the water wearing the protective suit. It turned out he had done this just to test the suit's seal. Juliet was deeply moved by his gesture, but with the situation in Silo 18 growing more dire, she had no choice but to say goodbye to Solo and set off on her own toward home. Upon hearing that Juliet could stop the safeguard procedure, Bernard lowered the weapon in his hand. At that moment, the iron door to the interior opened, and Juliet, frantic, stepped forward to intervene. Bernard tried to stop her, but it was too late. Suddenly, the wall protruded, and flames shot out in a massive burst. At the end of the story, there's a conversation between a man and a woman, which seems to take place before the construction of the silo. From their dialogue, it's clear that tensions between nations are escalating, and they are even preparing to use nuclear weapons, likely the origin of the post-apocalyptic world. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.